Hello, true crimers. Welcome to my brand spanking new podcast. You asked and you asked and you asked for years, especially in my TikTok comment sections, and well, I finally did it. You're welcome. So this is my first official attempt at recording a new case specifically for a podcast. I am still trying to learn the ropes and get this all figured out, so it may take me some time. I have been saying that when it comes to podcasts, I am basically the equivalent of a 97-year-old man who's been in a coma for 50 years and have never heard of this newfangled internet thing. I am clueless when it comes to this. But we shall figure it out. We shall prevail. Maybe. Hopefully. Sure. To those who don't know, I am Mike. I have been telling true crime stories over on TikTok for 4 or 5 years now. You'll have to excuse the dogs barking in the background. I do apologize. I am making a true crimer over on TikTok, where I've gotten about 3 million or so followers, which I am, of course, always forever grateful for. I have probably told somewhere around 3,500, maybe even up to 4,500 cases over there. I've also been doing more of the longer form thing on YouTube for a few years. Still trying to get that going strong. Been a bit of a struggle, but hey, we're working on it. But usually those videos are usually like 20, 25 minutes, probably on average or so. Sometimes shorter, sometimes a lot longer. It just really depends. If you are wondering, by the way, why my name is Making a True Crime-er, because crimer is not a word, right? Well, it's because when I started my TikTok page, I was already, let me tell you, obsessed with the Netflix docuseries Making a Murderer, the case about the murder of Teresa Halbach, which led to the convictions, of course, if you may probably know, of Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey. I am, by the way, absolutely on team both Stephen and Brendan are innocent, but hey, don't judge. But I thought it would be a clever, take, to take my favorite true crime show and spin it into my handle online, which led to Making a True Crime-er. So, murderer, crime-er. You get it. Yeah? Right? Hopefully. Sure. But anyway, that's me. So please follow me on whatever podcast place you are hearing this. Follow my TikTok and most importantly, my YouTube channel. Again, it's Making a True Crime-er on all platforms. The same way you see it spelled here is where it is spelled everywhere. No matter where you're listening, it's spelled the same way. So the way I do this is I work off a massive list of names on my case list. Most of the cases are actually recommended by all of you wonderful folks, which you can send me case recommendations to mikey@truecrimeer.com. But I will randomly zip through and scroll like a crazy person on that list, and I will randomly pick the case that I will be covering, which brings me to today's tragic and quite honestly, very, very brutal story. None of these stories are for the faint of heart, of course, but this one has some extremely gruesome details. But this is the case of Lora Ann Sinner. As usual, viewer discretion is strongly advised. Lora Ann Sinner was born on October 25th, 1977, and she spent the majority of her life in Yakima, Washington. It sounds like her family owned a dairy farm, and so Lora and her 2 siblings were always helping and working on the farm. She had 2 brothers. Their names were Jason and Ryan, or their names are Jason and Ryan. By all accounts, it was a relatively happy family for some time. Lora ends up graduating high school there in Yakima and started to attend college. Lora was also a deeply religious person, and her faith was one of the anchors in her life. Described as an incredibly devoted member of her church, she also did volunteer missions for the church in and around Yakima and also in the Aberdeen, Washington area. Just sounds like it was a really huge part of her life. But unfortunately, the family dynamic was sadly shattered in 1997. Lora's mother, Valletta, she had sadly passed away after a battle with leukemia. Her and her mom were close and had a very tight bond, and so when her mom passed away, it left this really deep emotional scar in Lora, obviously. and it maybe knocked her off of course a bit, as these types of things tend to do. But I got to a point where Lora needed a break, something to get away from the recent tragedy, something to maybe just sort of clear her mind. And so shortly after her mother's passing, Lora would reconnect with a fling she had from her freshman year in college, a man named Timothy Smith. Lora and Timothy would end up moving away from Yakima and eventually went to his hometown, which was in Redding, California. This is, I think, from what I can tell by looking at the maps, about 500 miles south of where she grew up in Yakima. But for her, this was a change of pace, maybe a necessary change of pace. Lora told her family that her and Timothy, they loved each other very much. The plan was they were going to go to Redding. She was going to be able to meet Timothy's family, get to know them, and then eventually they would get married themselves and start their own family. But Lora's dad, it sounds like, just had this gut feeling, this intuition that something was off from the start. He didn't want Lora to go with Timothy. I was reading in one newspaper article where he said, quote, "I said right out loud, the next phone call that I get will be that she is dead," end quote. Timothy wasn't exactly the best of guys and the best of influences, but wasn't really the ideal person that Lora maybe should have been with. But at the same time, she was an adult. She was 19 or 20 years old and was free to make her own decisions, as we all are as adults, even if the family was against it. Sadly, her father's instincts would eventually prove to be tragically correct. The last time that Kenneth Sinner, which is her dad, heard from his daughter was on April 1st of 1998. She had actually called him to say that her and Timothy had actually broken up. And Kenneth told her on the phone, "Tell me where I can send you money. I will get you a bus so you can come back home. You can be back with us, the family. Our door is open for you. Please come home." But Lora declined and said that she actually wanted to stay in Redding. Timothy Smith, her now ex, because they were actually engaged, but the engagement was broken off. But Timothy grew up in a really horrible situation. Timothy and his brother, Paul Gordon Smith, they had been repeatedly sexually assaulted by their own father when they were kids. Something that eventually their dad ends up confessing to and was even convicted of doing. Because he was convicted when they were still underage, they were still children, they were put into the foster care system. And at times they were growing up away from one another. They were bouncing around from home to home. They also had a younger sister named Lori Smith, who also was a part of the foster care system, who also bounced around from place to place. Paul ends up in a group home situation at one point where, at least on one occasion, from what I can see, he attacked several members of the institution. He also attacked other residents and patients at this facility. Paul had also been accused of committing various sexual assaults, and in early 1998, he had been arrested for actually robbing a sex worker. But at a certain point, all of the Smith kids who grew up with all of this trauma, who had been bounced around from the foster care system, they actually end up moving back in together, and I think even their father was involved because he was out of prison at that point. But Lori, the sister, Timothy and Paul's sister, she actually becomes really close with her brother, Paul. Lori starts dating Paul's close friend, Eric Rubio. Now, Paul himself who was, I think, about 21 or so when he met her, but he met a girl named Amy Stevens in one of these institutions he was in. Amy Stevens was just 14 years old. When Lora and Timothy broke up, Timothy actually ends up distancing himself from his siblings. I'm not sure the precise reasons why. Lora, on the other hand, actually had become friends with Timothy's brother and sister, which it sounds like it's something Timothy was not really fond of her doing. But he himself, Timothy, basically cut ties from them, or at least he just stopped being around them. And then on April 18th, 1998, Lora's father's premonition of getting a phone call announcing his daughter's death would sadly become a grim reality. The Shasta County Sheriff's Office was called to go look at a campsite that appeared to have been just completely trashed and annihilated. So the Shasta County Sheriff's Office goes there, and I believe this was on some kind of private land. But when the authorities arrive, there is garbage everywhere. There's alcohol bottles, garbage, and the site itself appeared to have been the location of some kind of like major fight or scuffle. Things were just moved about, tossed around, things were dislodged. And then they find a small amount of blood next to a large campfire with a whole bunch of logs that still seem to be smoldering. They actually had a dog with them, the police, and the dog picked up on something under the fire pit. As they start to pull the debris and the logs and the smoldering ashes away, they uncover something horrific, a human body. It was actually the body of a younger female. She was completely nude. She had a plastic bag wrapped and tied around her head and covered in blood. It was immediately obvious that she had been struck over the head with an instrument, probably several times from what it just appeared at first glance. Near the campfire, they also found this huge unopened can of like a family can of baked beans. This can had been severely dented and it was caked in blood, like blood was all over it. And what they assumed from the get-go when they saw this, based off the injuries to this young woman, was that this baked can of beans, unopened, had probably been at least one of the weapons used to kill this young woman. She also had a whole bunch of bruises all over her body, which appeared to be very, very fresh. She also had several cuts and gashes on her arms and throughout her body, and she had some pretty severe slits to her wrists. The autopsy would end up showing that her main cause of death was severe blunt force trauma to her skull, but asphyxiation was also a significant factor, which was due to the bag being wrapped really tight around her face. It's also possible that the cuts to her wrists played a role in her death as well, maybe from possibly blood loss, but she also, when they did a toxicology, they found that she had a very, very high amount, a fatal blood alcohol level of 0.88. The coroner determined that this was not a quick death. This was a slow, painful, agonizing death. This death, whatever happened to this poor young woman, was absolute torture. She was literally living, alive, for quite some time before eventually succumbing to all of the horrific injuries that were inflicted to her body. Dental records would confirm that this was in fact the body of 20-year-old Lora Ann Sinner. Her father was notified and everything he had feared had become true. But was it Timothy, her now ex-fiance, who was responsible for this really atrocious, horrendous crime against his daughter? Well, Timothy was brought in for questioning, and when they informed him of Laura's death, he actually appeared to be genuinely shocked and truly upset, like he was crying. Everything about his reaction to them telling her she had been killed, it felt very authentic to them. He told investigators that the last time he saw Lora was actually on March 30th. He told them that she had recently fallen in with his siblings. He wasn't a big fan of it, especially that since he himself had already distanced himself from them. And Timothy said that Lora at the time was actually living at his father's house because, again, his dad was back and living at home. Gee, that's probably not an awkward situation at all. But he mentions to police, talk to my brother and my sister. They were the ones who were with her. I wasn't. They probably know a lot more than what I'll ever be able to tell you about whatever happened to Lora out there. So investigators learn of the very troubled past of the Smith family. They know about Paul and his recent history of violence, robbery, sexual assaults. But before they can really do anything further, into the sheriff's department walks a teenage girl named Amy Stevens, and she had a story to tell investigators. She says she knows what happened to Lora because she was there when Lora was murdered. This 14-year-old girl says that there was a camping trip to this private property that involved her boyfriend Paul Smith, Paul's sister Lori, Lori's boyfriend Eric Rubio, and Lora Sinner was with them as well because she had just become a part of this friend group. Lora, though, was the only one there during this camping trip that wasn't there with a partner or a boyfriend. Amy tells investigators that while they were sitting around the campfire, Lora starts flirting with Paul Smith, which is Amy Stevens' then boyfriend. So Being Paul's girlfriend, Amy, gets immediately angry. She screams at Lora, walks right up to her, and punches her in the face, saying, quote, "That's for flirting with PJ," end quote. PJ was Paul's nickname. According to Amy, this led to a physical fight between her and Lora. Then at some point, Paul picks up the big can of baked beans, and he just smacks it over Lora's head. Amy then says Paul took a tool that he had. It was essentially like this big metal pipe with a kind of a bent end, and he began to beat Lora repeatedly until she was dead. So the next person they find is Lori Smith, and they bring her in to talk to her. This is again Paul's sister. Lori confirms that Amy was in fact the one who instigated the fight between her and Lora by punching her. However, she does alter the story by saying it was her brother Paul. He was basically damn near forcing everyone to drink in order to get extremely drunk. And then at that point, he then just suddenly attacks Lora out of a drunken rage. She tells investigators about Paul, quote, "He started beating up on Lora, put a rope around her neck, tied her legs and tied her arms, and threw her onto the wrestling mat by the tent that we were using. And he said, 'I'm going to slice your wrists open. I'm going to make it look like you tried to kill yourself. And he made us watch that,' end quote. Lori says that she watched as Paul put the bag over Lora's head and beat her over the head with the tool he had with him until Lora stopped moving and screaming. He then tells Eric Rubio, "You're going to help me get rid of this body or else, you're going to be the next one to die, bud." Paul then looks at the other two young women and says, and this is including his own freaking sister and girlfriend, and says, "A word of this to anyone, and you're going to be just like Lora. You're going to be dead too." So now police need to find Paul, and at first it seems like he's off the grid. Okay, well then maybe we could find Mr. Rubio. And that's when they learned that both Paul and Eric Rubio have already been arrested. Not for anything to do with Lora's murder, but because they stole a Jeep sometime after the murder happened. They got caught doing this and they were arrested. So they first talked to Eric Rubio. He gives yet another story. He says that they were having a good time at this camping trip. It was just a small party amongst this tiny group of friends. All of them were drinking and even doing some drugs. But Eric said that Lora, who was the odd person out, because again, she wasn't there with anyone like a partner or a boyfriend, well, I guess she was starting to annoy everyone for whatever reason. And so Amy Stevens got so annoyed with Lora that she just walked up to her and randomly started a physical fight with her. But Lora actually started to beat up on Amy and was clearly actually winning the fight. That's when Lori Smith went over and pulled Lora off of Amy. And again, Amy, a 14-year-old child, then grabs the can of unopened beans, and she's the one who bashes it over Lora's head. Lora Smith grabs the can from Amy, and she proceeds to strike Lora numerous times. So now you have multiple people with this can of beans hitting her over the head. At this point, according to Eric Rubio, the girls then drag Lora to the nearby water to rinse all the blood out of her hair. I don't know if that means they're just like trying to be helpful to the girl they just beat up or what, but that's when they notice that there is this massive gash and she has a literal open skull fracture on Lora's head. This is when, in the version of this story that Mr. Rubio's giving, Paul Smith intervenes. He takes a rope, he ties Lora up, he pulls out this knife or a small switchblade or something. He looks Lora dead in her eyes and says to her, quote, "Do you want to cut your own wrists, or do you want me to do it for you?" End quote. Eric says that Lora then chose to cut her own wrists because she was suffering and dying, but she couldn't do it. She didn't have the strength. So Paul yanks the knife back and slits very deep cuts into Lora's wrists. And if this wasn't enough evil already, he then takes alcohol, a thing of booze, and he dumps it into her fresh opened wounds on the slit wrists. He pours alcohol onto it, putting her in even more extreme pain and absolute agony. He then forces her mouth open and dumps an entire bottle of whiskey down Lora's throat, which is why ultimately her blood alcohol level was so high. Lora eventually slumps over. Paul then kicks her in the head as she's already down and tied up. But Lora was still alive, still fighting. So Lori Smith takes the tool mentioned earlier in the earlier stories, and she starts to beat Lora over the head, but she was too weak, apparently. And so Paul grabbed the tool from his sister, and he continued to beat Lora, repeatedly striking her over her head. Eric Rubio says Paul says to him, quote, "Then he said, 'Man, come help me fucking bury her.' And I was like, 'No, man, fuck that.' And then he said, 'Man, if you don't fucking help me bury her, man, I'm gonna kill you.'" End quote. So after hearing this story, they next bring in Paul Smith for questioning. And he just confesses to all of it. He says it was Eric Rubio's story that was the true story, or at least the most accurate story of all of them. But it was also all of them involved. All of the people there had participated in this murder in some capacity. Eric Rubio, it sounds like, was the only one who didn't physically involve himself in the actual attack, but he was there, he didn't stop it, and he did help dispose of her body. Now, Paul almost tries to make it sound like a mercy killing, almost like he did Lora a favor, maybe in some twisted way of trying to make himself look like some kind of fucking hero. I don't know, but he had made it sound like the wounds to her head from the can of beans caused by Lori and Amy was so bad that Lora stood no chance of living. I guess he determined that himself before, trying to get her help. So he says, I put her out of her misery. Except, no. Fuck no. He prolonged her death. He dragged it out. He made her suffer more. He taunted her almost. He forced a whole body of whiskey down her throat. He slit her wrists, poured alcohol on her slit wrists, kicked her in the head, then beat her with a pipe. That's not putting someone out of their misery. That's causing the misery. That's torture. Sick fuck. Sorry. 20-year-old Paul Smith, his 19-year-old sister Lori Smith, 18-year-old Eric Rubio, and 14-year-old Amy Stevens were all arrested and charged in the torture and murder of Lora Sinner. Eric and Lori would end up taking plea deals as long as they agreed to testify against Paul Smith, which they did. Both of them were convicted and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. Eric Rubio was released from prison on parole, I think around 2015. Lori Smith ends up applying for parole in 2021, and despite her heavy involvement in the physical attack, she was granted parole in 2021 and was released. Now, because Amy Stevens was a child when all of this happened, she ends up getting a small slap on the wrist. In most of the versions, Amy is really the one who instigated everything. She started the fight. She caused the escalation. Don't tell me, oh, she's just a kid who, what does she know? She knew enough. She knew enough. She knew enough at one point to grab a large can of beans and bash it over Lora's head with the intent of harming and even possibly killing her. She actively participated in this murder. She knows what murder is. She knows that murder is wrong, yet she still chose to act. But because she was just a kid, she was put into a juvenile facility to be released at the age of 25, in which she was released in 2009. Paul Smith goes on trial in 2002. The other 3 co-defendants all end up testifying against him, and he is very quickly found guilty, convicted, and sentenced to death for the horrific, brutal torture murder of 20-year-old Lora Sinner. But in 2015, California put a moratorium on the death penalty, so his conviction ends up being changed, and it's altered to life in prison without parole, which is where that sad little fuck will be until he is dead, and he will rot, hopefully. And all for what? What did this happen for? Because Lora flirted with someone who was actually her age? Amy was 5 or 6 years younger than Paul. So what was she killed for? Being a human with, emotions? These people are sick, disgusting, twisted monsters. The fact that 3 of Lora's killers are now roaming the world right next to you and me, free as a bird, is insane to me. Lora didn't deserve what happened to her. Her final moments were a painful nightmare. And I just hope that in some way, in those final moments, she was able to think about her time working on the farm with her family, smiling with her brothers, helping her dad. I hope she got to see their faces one last time, instead of the faces of the monsters who were inflicting this horrible horror story upon her. And I hope most of all that she flashed to all the beautiful moments she had with her mother. And I sincerely believe that Lora has reunited with her mom, and they are finally together again, and that they are now both together, resting in peace. But that's actually the end of this tragic, horrific story. Unfortunately, there are countless more stories out there just like Laura's. And I hope telling these tragedies helps people learn how precious life is. I hope hearing these stories helps people keep their guard up because you never know who's lurking in your life, even the people who are your friends or your loved ones. You just unfortunately never know. Please remember to follow me here. Check out my TikTok and my YouTube. Thank you all so much for listening to my first official ever podcast episode, technically. But I will be back to your ears, I believe, next week. So until then, have a great week, true crime Boop. I don't know why I booped. Sorry.